Hours after the fall of Winterfell, Daenerys, Jon and Sansa finally landed at the twins. Daenerys breathed a reluctant sigh of relief as they were greeted by Walder Frey.
"Welcome, my honoured guests. Queen Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen and Sansa Stark, or should I say Bolton. I welcome you into my great—"
Sansa interrupted him and demanded his head for his betrayal of her family at the Red Wedding, but Daenerys defended him.
"He bent the knee to me, and I will not have one of my sworn lords murdered," she said firmly.
As the day wore on, a feast was held in the same halls where most of House Stark saw their bitter end. Jon entered the Great Hall. He was already on edge, having lost his brother and watched his home fall to the Night King. But when he looked up and saw a taxidermied direwolf head mounted above Walder's dining table, all of his pent-up rage boiled over. In that moment, he was no longer the changed man who had left his soldiers and own brother to die. He was the son of Eddard Stark, and he would not tolerate the desecration of his family's sigil and one of their beloved pets. Without a second thought, Jon drew his sword, Longclaw, and plunged it into Walder's chest. Blood poured down onto the direwolf-shaped hilt as Walder's body slumped to the ground. The other lords and ladies of the Riverlands looked on in shock as Jon stood there, panting and covered in blood. Daenerys was horrified. "We will have to answer for this," she said quietly as she surveyed the scene. "But for now, let us attend to the matters at hand." And with that, the feast continued, as did the planning of the next great battle with the dead, albeit in a much quieter and more sombre tone. As they prepared to leave the twins and continue their journey south, Daenerys pulled Jon aside. "I know what it's like to have your family slaughtered," she said softly. "But I gave a clear order not to start another feud. We have to be strong and united if we're going to win this war, and we cannot afford to anger any more lords." Jon nodded, but his eyes were still blazing with anger. He knew that he couldn't let his emotions get the best of him again, but it was easier said than done. The Night King was coming, and he would stop at nothing to destroy everything they held dear.
As they made their way towards Harrenhal, the combined forces of the Riverlands and Daenerys were greeted by the armies of Dorne and the Reach, along with a ragtag group of Lannister soldiers who had defected from Cersei's army. Despite their past conflicts, they knew that the only way to survive was to unite against the common enemy. The forces of the living promptly began erecting defenses. They dug pit traps filled with dragonglass spears and stationed cavalry flanks at strategic points. They hoped to lure the dead into the open field, where they could use their superior numbers and tactics to their advantage. However, the situation was far from ideal. After the death of Viserion, Daenerys was forced to use her 2 remaining dragons more sparingly, as they were the only real hope they had against the Night King and his army of the dead. The gust of cold wind that blew across the battlefield only added to the growing sense of dread and fear that permeated the air. The people of the Vale and the Riverlands had already begun to evacuate further south, knowing that they were no match for the oncoming threat. Those of fighting age and condition had enlisted in their respective armies, hoping to do their part in the coming battle. And so they waited, their hearts heavy with the weight of their impending doom. They knew that the fate of the realm rested on their shoulders, and that the coming battle would be their last stand. But they also knew that they had no choice but to fight, to give everything they had, for the flickering hope that the realm might survive.
Jon Snow stood atop his horse, overlooking the field where the army of the living had gathered, his eyes fixed on the cold fog that approached Harrenhal. The wind was bitter and cold, and the ground was frozen beneath his feet. He knew that this would be the final battle. The fate of the realm and the survival of humanity itself rested on their success in this moment. He drew in a deep breath and turned to face his troops, who stood ready to fight at his side. They were a group, united by a common purpose and a shared sense of desperation. They were the last line of defense against the relentless onslaught of the Night King and his army of the dead, and they were the largest combined army that Westeros had ever seen.
"My fellow men and women of Westeros,"
Jon began, his voice ringing out over the field.
"We stand on the brink of oblivion. We face an enemy that seeks to extinguish all life from this land, to leave it barren and empty, a wasteland of death and decay. But we will not let that happen. We will stand together, shoulder to shoulder, and we will fight for the living. We will fight for our families, our friends, and all those who came before us and sacrificed all so we could stand here today. We may not win this battle. Guards, we may not even survive it. But we will go down fighting, with honor and courage, and we will not falter. We will not break. We will fight until our last breath. We may not win this battle.
John continued, his voice growing hoarse.
Gods, we may not even survive it. But we will go down fighting, with honor and courage, and we will not falter, we will not break. We will fight until our last breath, and we will not let these rotting fucks consume all that we care for. For we are the defenders of the realm, the protectors of the living, and we will do whatever it takes to protect humanity from the darkness that lies ahead.
The soldiers let out a deafening roar, their swords and spears clanging together in a show of unity and strength. John smiled, feeling a surge of pride and determination well up inside him. For the first time since his death, he felt that he belonged amongst soldiers from all across the lands he had been protecting all along.
Today we make our stand,
he declared, his eyes flashing with a fierce determination that even Ned Stark himself would shiver at the sight of.
Today we fight for everything that matters. Today we fight the dead for the sake of the living. And may the stranger greet us with open arms as we delve into the cold, hard night. Never was much good at speeches,
John told himself. But the roars of the soldiers at his side cared little. They took any words they could get, for they knew they may well be the last words they would ever hear. Suddenly, an icy gush struck the defenders, and the once roused armies suddenly fell on dead silence. Before Jon Snow let out a shattering battle cry and began galloping towards the very front of the lines, intent on joining the vanguard who were eagerly awaiting the arrival of the dead.
The undead army charged, a wave of death sweeping towards the living. The battle was on, and it was brutal. The clash of steel on steel, the screams of the dying, the roar of the dragons overhead all filled the air. The living fought with all their might, their determination and courage giving them strength, even as the dead seemed to have endless numbers. Jon Snow fought with all his might, his sword flashing in the sunlight as he cut down wights left and right. But even he was pushed to the brink of exhaustion by the sheer number of foes. As the battle raged on, Jon found himself face to face with the Night King. The two circled each other warily, their eyes locked in a deadly stare. The Night King was a formidable opponent, his icy armor and weapon glinting menacingly in the light. Jon knew he had to be careful. One mistake would spell his certain death. The two charged at each other, their swords clashing with a deafening ring and icy crackle that echoed throughout the battlefield. The Night King was an expert swordsman far beyond Jon's capabilities, who, though he might have been the most skilled swordsman on the front that day, he was far from the level of the great legends. Jon regretted not letting Sir Barristan join him in the front lines. They exchanged blows, and in one swift move Jon was knocked to the ground, his sword knocked out of his hand. The Night King raised his sword for the final blow, but suddenly, as if by some sick divine blessing, his attention was drawn away. There was a burst of intense flames stretching across the battlefield. A dragon was flying overhead, breathing flames that were like a rainbow of colours, unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It was Daenerys's dragon, Rhaegal, but something was different. His flames were now intensely hot, sweeping across the field and decimating the undead with ease, leaving glass in its wake. The White Walker commanders on the battlefield realised what was happening, and they moved to stop Rhaegal. But any attempt to down the dragon fell short, as his manoeuvres throughout the sky seemed impressively sophisticated, while his flames resumed burning with a fierce intensity that seemed almost otherworldly. The droves of undead and their White Walker generals fell to the ground in charred, lifeless heaps. The Night King was enraged by the extreme losses suffered by his army and the failure of his generals. He turned his attention to Rhaegal, a look of fury on his face. Jon Snow saw his chance and charged at the Night King's side, Longclaw lunging towards the distracted foe. But the Night King instantly shifted attention back to Jon, and the two met in a clash of steel and ice, sparks and shards of ice flying as the two blades met. Jon Snow fought with all his might. The Night King was a formidable foe, but Jon was determined to stop him. As they fought, Jon could see the anger and frustration on the Night King's face as he watched Rhaegal continue to decimate his army, a look so terrifyingly hateful that Jon could barely look at his opponent. As the White Walkers fell one by one, Jon could see that the Night King was tiring. He pressed his attack, forcing the Night King back step by step. Finally, Jon saw his opening. He thrust his sword forward, the point of Longclaw piercing the Night King's chest. The Night King let out a piercing scream that could be heard all the way past King's Landing as he crumbled to the ground, shattering into 1,000 pieces of ice. Jon's ears were ringing intensely. He was disoriented and slumped to the ground, exhausted and with the scream of the Night King abusing his body and soul. But the battle was over. The army of the dead lay in ruins, their White Walker generals defeated, and the Night King was dead. Jon Snow looked up, watching as Rhaegal continued to fly overhead, his magical flame still burning with an otherworldly intensity. The once army of the dead was quickly reducing in numbers, crushing under the heat of the mighty dragon, and the few defenders brave enough to press on. It was then that Jon sensed something familiar from Rhaegal, an acute sense of familiarity protruding from the dragon, and then it finally dawned on him. Brandon Stark had been reborn into the dragon, his life force still coursing with the powers of the First Men that was imbued into his very soul.